Tonight, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to welcome Richard Wolffe, here to discuss Revival, the struggle for survival inside the Obama White House. Revival is a follow-up to Richard Wolffe's campaign biography, Renegade, The Making of a President, which NPR's Michelle Norris praised. A clear-eyed, up-close look at the campaign, Renegade is the one Obama book that should not be missed. Well, Mr. Wolffe has brought us another Obama portrait that shouldn't be missed. With unrivaled access to the president, Richard Wolffe tells an epic political tale that follows Obama and his inner circle from the crisis of defeat to historic success. This is the inside story of a defining period of the young Obama White House. Richard Wolffe is an award-winning journalist and political analyst for MSNBC, appearing frequently on Countdown with Keith Olbermann and Hardball with Chris Matthews. He covered the entirety of Barack Obama's presidential campaign for Newsweek magazine, and before Newsweek, Wolffe was a senior journalist at the Financial Times, serving as its deputy bureau chief and U.S. diplomatic correspondent. We are very pleased to bring him to Harvard Bookstore tonight. Please join me in welcoming Richard Wolffe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you all for coming. It's cold outside. I mean, I find it cold. I tweeted, the pilot said it was a nice day in Boston and it was 18 degrees. And that sounds pretty cold to me. And someone from Boston obviously said, well, that's a nice day for us. So 18 degrees is cold. Thank you. So thank you for coming out. Thank you especially to the bookstore for rescheduling this. We were supposed to have this on Wednesday. My publisher said it would be fine. It's Boston. They don't mind about snow. I said, 18 inches is quite a lot. So thank you all for digging your way out, and to the bookstore especially. This is a really special place. So it's a real pleasure to be here, not just because I like speaking, but because all our independent bookstores are treasures for our communities. And my local bookstore is Politics and Prose in DC. I grew up with bookstores. When my father would travel anywhere, he would always come back from the local bookstore with some dusty tome that he'd picked up at some knockdown price. And I just think it's really important that we sustain this because they are so important to our communities, because they have a unique link to our communities, to their customers. And so please keep coming back, whether to buy or just to listen. It's really important. I'm going to have a sip of water. This is the sort of end of this round of my book tour. So you're very special in a way, because rather than just giving you my regular old speech about the book, I've got all of these experiences that I've gathered over the last couple of months, and I know Harvard is a special place generally, and this bookstore is especially important. But and by the way, it's hard for me as someone who graduated from Oxford to say that Harvard is special, but I'm going to say it anyway. But when the book came out, which was 2 weeks after the midterms, my beloved reviewer in the Washington Post said, and this was his lead, not that I cared in any way or remember it, said that the word revival was best associated with the Republican Party because they had had this tremendous turnaround. They just won the midterms, and basically what an idiot this author was for calling his book Revival about Obama, the guy who blew it in 2 years. That was a little bit harsh, and also a little bit premature, I'm glad to say. I have printed up many T-shirts saying "I told you so," but let's just look at what happened since then, which was only 2 months ago. 2 months, 2 little months. 2 weeks after the book came out, Obama came up with this big tax deal with the Republican Party, which essentially remade the entire 2 years of politics, because suddenly, having denied him any claim of bipartisanship, Republicans suddenly were in bed with this guy, who they'd said was a socialist, a tyrannical dictator, whatever the latest thing was. And it amounted to a second stimulus. The White House just today is beating the drum about the payroll tax cut, which people are getting now. right now, which independent economists think is going to add substantially to growth this year. So there was the tax deal, and then, of course, there was the START treaty, and then there was Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There was a whole string of things that people said would never happen. Never happen, because the presidency was over, and Obama was a failure, and they'd blown it, and the only thing that was having a revival was the Republican Party. And then just this week, we had the sad events and the memorial service, that extraordinary memorial service in Tucson. And people said, on the right and the left, I watched Fox News that night. I don't know if you did. Maybe not. But they said, wow, this is the guy we all thought he was in 2004, not so far away from here at the convention speech, in 2008, through the election. Where did this man go? And how come he's back? Well, the answer is that it was always there. And the reason I called the book Revival, the reason I chose what some other reviewers maybe said was a ridiculously arbitrary time period. Why was that important? Why was a period a year ago, just a couple of months, important to me, important, I think, to the White House? Well, let me scroll you back to what happened. You should remember it because it was a period that around the time of the first anniversary of the inauguration, when the Democrats had just lost the Massachusetts Senate race. And you know what people said at that time? They said the presidency was over. The guy blew it. Healthcare was dead. Nothing was ever going to happen again for that man. And his politics were finished. The country had changed, they rejected him, and at the 1 year mark, he was a complete failure. And healthcare, by the way, was finished too. And then 2 months later, at the end of the period that I sort of embedded myself in the White House, 2 months later, he signs healthcare into law. Historic achievement, which to this day, Republicans think is the worst thing ever, and Democrats may be debating, but was still the culmination of a Democratic dream for several generations. So I looked at that period and thought, well, for a start, this is an incredible test. This is the first existential crisis this White House has had. So for that reason alone, the period was really important to me and to them. But it also was important because it harked back to many things that I'd seen through the campaign, which was that repeatedly, there had been these huge swings of the pendulum from failure to success and back again, with almost nothing in between. So he'd been written off many times before. In 2007, he had this big spike when he launched, and then he flatlined, and he couldn't take a punch, and he couldn't deliver a punch, and that was most of 2007. That was most of the first year of the campaign. And then he won in Iowa. Everyone says, wow, he's amazing. And then a few days later, he loses in New Hampshire, and he's a flash in the pan, and he's blown it. And then he actually loses again in Nevada, and then he wins in South Carolina. And it goes on and on and on. The pendulum goes back and forth from these tremendous highs to these desperate lows. And don't think, by the way, just because they happen all the time, that it's easy for the people in the middle of them, because it's not. They find it incredibly challenging to get beaten up. And this is true of the president as well, and then the candidate. They get beaten up in the press, online. Their donors, their supporters, the members of Congress all say, what are you doing? How could you screw it up so badly? And yet they keep coming back. He keeps coming back. So there was this process of revival. The reason I chose the word revival was partly to capture that comeback, coming back from the dead. But partly it was also to look at the question of, why does this keep happening? I mean, really, there's something wrong if you have to keep going back and forth from failure to success. Partly, of course, it's the exaggerations of the pundits or members of Congress or the supporters and the panic and fear and hope and all those emotional roller coaster aspects of it. But partly it's also the way they are and who they are. So I wanted to look at what in the White House, what in this core team of people around this president made this happen. And I came up with or I sort of stumbled upon, through my reporting, a really sharp dividing line inside the White House, inside the president's team, about the campaign itself, about what 2008 meant, about the identity of the man in the Oval Office. And that's not a small thing. You know, every institution divided itself up into two camps. There's that old joke about the Jewish guy on the desert island who's built, do you know this one? I'm going to mess it up. But, you know, they find this guy on the desert island and he's built two synagogues. And, you know, they say, why do you have two synagogues? And he says, well, there's the synagogue that I go to and there's the one I wouldn't be seen dead in. And it's true that every place has at least two camps. And in the Bush White House, there were the hawks and the doves, or, you know, the neocons and the old-style conservatives. And then in this White House, it's not an ideological dispute, but it is a really sharp dividing line that has played out time and time again over who he is, what they're trying to do. And one person said to me, well, this is the Washington crowd and the non-Washington crowd. And this person has spent their life in Washington. So I was like, well, I don't think it's a geography thing, but that kind of captures some of the spirit of this dispute, whether they were going to bring change or whether they were going to play the old Washington game, whether they were going to have transparency and reform and keep lobbyists out of the White House, or whether they were going to have sort of bend the rules and the odd lobbyist here and there and sign 9,000 earmarks into law, because that's the way Washington works. And the truth is that over that course of the first year, the more compromises they made to the way Washington worked, the more people thought, well, is that really who we thought he was? When you ask people about healthcare, what don't you like about healthcare? Once you scrape away the socialist government takeover stuff, it comes down often to a couple of things, like the Nebraska deal and the Louisiana Purchase, these sweetheart things, or on the left, the deals with the industry, the drug industry, for instance. Those backroom deals that inside Washington politics are what made people think maybe he's not playing straight with us. So there's this sharp division, and that took me back to the theme of revival, because it was a revival of the campaign spirit that the campaign team wanted to bring back. And versus the revivalists who, and it's a slightly ironic thing, I admit that's lost on some people, but revivalists is kind of exaggerated. These are people who are true believers. I mean, there's a slight religious tone to it because they believe so strongly in the spirit of that campaign. And then on the other side, I call them the survivalists, the people who say, you know, it's desperate. We've just got to get by. We've just got to win. We've got to beat Republicans. We just, you know, do whatever it takes. And that's exaggerated too. I mean, is the world really that desperate? When you have such big majorities, do you have to do all these things? So those are the two sort of camps, and we can get into that. But those were the broad themes that I thought revival captured: how you deal with a campaign, and how you come back. And by the way, how you get into these messes. Now, for me as a writer, the revival theme was really was a blessing as well, because the book had its genesis in a question from actually Michelle Norris, who you just heard about. Michelle's a friend of mine, and as you know, if you listen to NPR, she's great at asking questions. And I gave her a manuscript of my campaign book, of Renegade, and asked her what she thought of it. And she said, well, it's really good, but what I really want to know, which is when my heart sank, she said, what I really want to know is how has he changed? This was sort of about February of 2009. Not what you want to hear when you've just finished a manuscript. What I really want to know, in other words, what you've missed and screwed up on. And it was a really good question, and it stuck with me. I told her, yeah, you know, that's a great question. Thank you very much, but I'm not going to rewrite my book now. My publisher won't be happy. So I did find that the question stuck with me and wormed its way in my head, because the idea of how you bring about change without changing yourself, what kind of changes you undergo when you are trying to change Washington, seemed to me fascinating, actually. one of the frustrations any of us in the media, any of us who've grown up in journalism have right now is the kind of collapse of the journalism model. There's a business crisis. Newspapers aren't making money. Magazines are losing money. The network, the broadcast news is collapsing in audience and advertising. And so what's taking its place? And you have a number of journalists who are filling their days, not making their living, but filling their days, tweeting and blogging, and it keeps them very, very busy. And that's there's nothing bad I intend to say about Twitter or blogs or any of the social networking things at all. But it's not fulfilling journalism. You can't really tell a story. You can grab attention and you can jump up and down. It's like those flashing lights in Vegas. You can say, look at me. And that fulfills a purpose, but it doesn't tell a story. It doesn't tell you about character. It doesn't explore theme. And in the White House, these stories are enormous. These characters are enormous. The challenges are enormous. And one thing that appealed to me about the change theme, about writing books, was that I could explore something much bigger than in a book than I could through a tweet or on cable TV or even in a newspaper story or a magazine. So the change theme was really helped shape my feelings about this follow-on book. And it turned out that change, bringing about change, was in the middle of this fault line between these revivalists and the survivalists. Because basically the survivalists didn't believe you could ever change Washington. I mean, they just don't buy it. And the campaign folks, the people I call the revivalists, are saying, no, that's what we're here for. That's what we said we would do. And it was a dispute that began even before the election came up. Because 2 weeks before the election, they already knew they were going to win. And the transition team, led by a guy called John Podesta, who was chief of staff in the Clinton years, one of Clinton's chief of staffs, said, there was a conference call with the campaign people, and he said, well, I know the candidate has made this pledge about keeping lobbyists outside the administration, but there are all these great people that we want to hire, and so how do you want to work around this? And this rumbled on for several days, if not weeks, and eventually the campaign folks in Chicago had to say, it wasn't an idle promise. I mean, he actually meant it. This is who we are. And they're astonished to this day that they had to explain that. Now, the truth is that actually some lobbyists did work their way into the administration. Other lobbyists are not, and are still frozen out. And those compromises were made maybe because there was an economic crisis, maybe because they were genuinely the best people. But they were also made because the character of the guy in the middle of it is conflicted. The reason there is this chronic dispute, the reason there is this sharp dividing line, is because you have a president who has a foot in both camps, who wants to have it both ways. He wants to change Washington and he wants to master Washington. And finding a balance between the two isn't easy. Now, it's the pragmatic side of him to be generous, to get things done. You have to learn the ways of Washington. You have to do certain deals. You have to get legislation passed. But you also need to have public support with you. And what we saw over the last 2 years is actually independents, especially, moving away from this guy. So it doesn't always work to make those compromises. And that, I think, is why you're seeing things change a little bit. Now, in my view, they're not changing as much as people suggest. Everyone says, oh, he's moving back to the center. He's triangulating. And that's kind of weird to me. Okay, for a start, he's not Bill Clinton. Can we just all agree that he is not Bill Clinton? Never will be, never was. In some ways, he was triangulating before he ever needed to. But that's because he was never the scary socialist, okay? I mean, if he was a socialist, he was a really, really bad socialist. You know, he had the chance to let Wall Street collapse. Capitalism could have collapsed under his watch. And what did he do? He saved it. My goodness, no good self-respecting communist would allow that to happen. Never mind saving GM and then selling all your shares. I mean, if you're a socialist, keep the damn shares. I enjoy that little conversation I have on talk radio, conservative talk radio, of course. They insist that he really is a socialist, and they have no idea what the word means. So, but there is a genuine, I think we've seen with that memorial speech, a genuine shift back into some of the themes from the 2008 campaign, especially what's a really difficult balance, which is how to raise the level of discourse, how to have an elevated debate when, frankly, it's not that elevated. I mean, it's pretty simple and base and vitriolic. And I say this as a cable TV guy, okay? We're all to blame. We can have a discussion about chicken and egg. Are we giving people what they want? Are we corrupting people in some way? But really, that's a debate that's been going on about journalism from the very beginning. You know, does journalism corrupt the masses, or are the masses already corrupt? You know, it's, you know, are the elites the people who should have information, or is democracy messy? Depending on the time of day and how much coffee I've had, I could argue it both ways. But the civility question is important because through the campaign, often not just outsiders, but people inside Obama's team would say, where do we strike this balance? We have to punch back. We have to defend ourselves against what Clinton or the Republicans are saying. And yet you have a candidate who said, no negative politics, no attack politics. Does anyone remember that? He actually said that. Everyone says, oh, this is him going back to the center. No, he was always there. And it was really hard for his people, who were hired guns for the most part, to know where to draw the line. And often they trod over the line. They walked all over it. There was a press release they put out about Hillary Clinton's ties to Indian American fundraisers, and they said that she was a senator from Punjab. And he was incredibly pissed. You know, people say he has no emotion. Oh, he has emotion. When he gets angry, the temperature in the room is about what it is outside. He was pissed, and not least because some of his closest friends from college were from the Indian subcontinent, and he had to call them up and apologize for the sort of xenophobia of his own campaign. That, by the way, was the day, that story, when that story broke, was the day he ended up in this small town in South Carolina where it rained on him, and he had to drive out in the middle of nowhere, and he came across this small woman who lifted his spirits by saying, fired up, ready to go. Fired up, ready to go lifted his spirits because of that Punjab story. So there's a little piece of campaign trivia for you. Civility is something that he will hold on to. It keeps him above the fray for 2012, while the Republicans are going to be throwing rocks at him. At some point, he's going to have to clamber down from the pedestal and throw rocks back. But it's not a bad position to start out this election cycle, because it has actually already begun. I'm just going to wrap up like this because you're a Harvard crowd, so I expect, you know, feisty questions. There have been suggestions from some people on the left and from many people on the right that this guy is ready to stand down, step aside, you know, kick out Joe Biden and put Hillary Clinton on the ticket, do something dramatic, because obviously everything's gone horribly wrong. That at least was the conventional wisdom all of 2 months ago. Apart from being ridiculous, it overlooks just one tiny thing about this guy, which is that he wants to win. He is exceptionally competitive. He and his wife can barely play cards with each other. Partly because she hates losing at anything, and partly because when he wins, he really rubs it in your face. And on the rare times that I've allowed him to win anything in games with me, he doesn't forget, ever. So You know, one of the reasons he got a fat lip at playing basketball was because he won't wear a mouth guard, and I suspect the reason for that is because that would stop him from trash talking. So, from what I've seen, being a short foreigner who wears glasses, he likes the trash talking. But I'll just end off with this one conversation I had with him when we were traveling, sort of mid-February of 2009. He was already on a winning streak, or he was just beginning his winning streak. And he said, we were talking about change and the meaning of change. We've been having this conversation for a while. And he said to me, you know, I could leave all of this behind. I could go back to what I was doing. And I said, that's nonsense. There's no way you could do that. He said, no, I really could. I could leave it all behind. I don't need to do any of this. I said, well, that's great. So you're just going to, having, you know, revved up all of these young folks and had all the big rallies, and you're just going to go back and teach law and hang out with your kids. And he said, yeah, I could. I was rolling my eyes. But he said, but you know, now I really want to win. Now they've annoyed me. Now, he was talking about the Clintons then, but he could have just as well be talking now, because he raises his game when he finally, ultimately, desperately needs to. One of the reasons they keep getting into these holes and then pulling themselves out is because he's kind of like a writer. He is a writer. He leaves things till the last minute, and maybe beyond the last minute. You know, he was writing that speech in Tucson on the way there. He was writing, I tell this story in Revival, he was writing his Nobel Prize winning acceptance speech, finishing it off in the limousine en route to the event site. Now, even for this writer, I think that's kind of risking it. But that's who he is. He leaves things to the last minute. He also is an extremely competitive guy. And when the big moment comes, it's rare that he really screws it up. So let's see how many times he has to screw it up before 2012. But it's going to be an interesting ride, and hopefully an interesting set of questions. So let's open it up. Well, let me say, first of all, for an administration that's top-heavy with people who think they can do communications, including the president, to screw up your communications that badly, it is really a significant failure. I mean, everyone agrees that they screwed up their messaging. They lost the message wars. Everyone, including the president and, in fact, the First Lady. One thing I describe in the book is how pissed she is about a year ago about how he's lost the message war, how he's seen as the inside Washington guy, that the change mantle has been transferred to the Republicans. So they've known about this for a long time. They've been having meetings about it for a very long time. And it's only now that you see really significant change in that message team. The two people who were really running the messaging in the White House are leaving, David Axelrod and Robert Gibbs, who are both who I respect enormously, but both of them would readily admit that they have struggled on messaging. Now, there are lots of environmental reasons why that would happen, lots of external reasons, whether it's about the economy, unemployment, the Republican strategy, whatever it is. But there's something else, because having a message problem, to me, is a symptom of something else. It's not the root cause. For many people inside the White House, maybe many Democrats, they would say, if you just fix messaging, then everything else is fine. It's not. And it's the result of something else, which is this identity question that I've been trying to sort of talk around. Are you, in a time when people want change, you know, voters wanted change in 2006. They voted for change in 2008. They voted for change again in 2010. If you don't represent change, if you don't speak to change in Washington, then the voters will kick you out. And the problem that they had was they felt that all of the changes they were bringing about with big legislation were self-evident. You didn't have to talk about it because people would understand that it was just going on. But that's just not true. People weren't paying attention in that way. And more than that, when they did talk about themselves, they didn't know whether they were playing this inside game or this outside game. Did they really need to talk to anyone outside the votes in Congress? Or could they just talk to a handful of people? And let me make it kind of more specific. When it came to healthcare, one of the problems they still have is describing what healthcare reform represents. And that's because as healthcare stumbled and struggled its way to actually becoming law, they deferred to members of Congress. They said, we're playing this inside game. We need to get all the votes we can. Incidentally, we're not going to get any Republicans because either we don't like them or they've decided that that's their strategy. And if we describe healthcare in any significant way, we're going to be closing the door to something. So if we say that the principle here is extending insurance to the uninsured, then Harry Reid has less room for maneuver. Nancy Pelosi has less room for maneuver. So we can't talk about it. So you had this mushball for most of that year. Until it all fell apart, they had no framework to talk about healthcare. They really didn't. They could talk about what was ailing the system, but they couldn't really talk about what they were trying to do. And one of the stories I have in the book, one of the ways they revived the whole healthcare messaging was to go back to literally a campaign ad. The script of a campaign ad, a TV ad, where they said, well, there are people on the left who want to have a government-run system like they do in Canada or Europe, and then there are people on the right who want to leave you to your insurers, and Barack Obama's the guy in the middle. That itself was a sort of defining moment, because at those times he was saying, okay, we've got our own plan. I know where I want this to end up. Enough with a congressional back and forth. We need something really clear. And it took them that moment of real crisis to get back to the campaign, to define who they were, and grapple with that identity question. So I don't know if I've answered the question directly, but the communications were screwed up really because they couldn't decide who they were or what they were trying to do. And explaining it meant that the strategy would fall apart, the strategy being an inside Washington game. Now they've realized, you know, it's not just about a few votes. They've got to actually speak to a bigger group of people, especially the voters they've lost, the independent voters. And that means a very different platform. They actually have a mission now. One of the problems they've had is that if you ask people, you know, what was the mission of the Bush administration? If I ask people around here, you know, people would all come up with something around the lines of kill the terrorists, keep us safe, defend America. You know, it was very clear. And it was very clear because they kept repeating it over and over again. And we might not agree with it, but that's what they said it was. If you ask people, what is the mission? I've played this little game here with folks in the White House. What's the mission of this administration? What do they say their mission is, as opposed to what we think it is? They'll all come up with something different. Helping people at the bottom, expanding opportunity, repairing relations with the rest of the world. It's all of those things, but it's not any of those things in particular. And I'll just end this off with like this. You know, in the middle of the campaign, the strategists, the consultants, the pollsters would say to Obama, you know, what people really want to hear is what you said in Boston about uniting red and blue America. There's a yearning for that. You should go out and say that same thing again. And he said, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. I've said it once already. Bush never said, I've said it once already, you know? Now, he did complain about having to say the same thing over and over again, but that's slightly different. So repetition is hard for writers, but it's actually necessary for politicians, especially in this culture. Yeah, there was a late recognition among Obama's people, and this again is something in this book, that they really couldn't afford him to be a prime minister. They'd kind of been, they'd set him up as the guy running the legislative process, and now they can't actually do that anymore because they're not going to get any legislation through. So that's sort of easier. But the president has to be bigger than that and has to speak to a broader audience. So we're seeing some of that recalibration now, but of course that's by necessity as well. It is interesting seeing the reaction to that memorial speech because I can't tell you how many times I've read the story that the guy is too cold, he doesn't have any emotional connection with people, he, you know, is too cerebral and cool and detached, and yet nobody's made that case this week. Funny. There's no accountability in the press. It's a wonderful thing. Well, I'm convinced she's running for president. I have not, all the people I hear who have said, no, she's not running for president. Of course, none of us really know. But all the people who say that she's not, I ask them why, and they come up with some reason like, well, she won't be able to make money anymore. And that's a temporary phase in making money, and she's made so much money she really doesn't need to work ever again, so I don't think that stacks up. Or there's the argument, well, she knows she can't win, and that's a strange argument to make because who knows whether you can win until you actually try. And if Barack Obama had listened to that, he'd never have got anywhere. He'd never have got in the race. So, you know, one of the things the Republicans are responding to, everyone always fights the last election. You know, it was a bit like the Democrats nominating John Kerry in 2004 because they were trying to replay 2002 in some ways. They wanted this sort of national security guy to go up against Bush, but they couldn't quite figure out, or they didn't have the choice to find out something different. The Republicans have this sort of, there's the fallacy of Obama that he made it look easy. He for them, this guy is a kind of fluke. He came out of nothing, and he showed that you don't have to do anything in your life. You don't have to have a resume. You can just ace it just by being smooth on TV. So Palin is there. I think one of the reasons Palin is attractive is because, of course, she lands a punch pretty well. But one of the other reasons is that they think she's kind of Obama-like. You don't have to achieve anything. You don't have to do being a half-term government. Well, he was a half-term, not even a third-term senator. So, which kind of overlooks just how you get tested through the course of a campaign. It is true he had a pretty thin resume, but it's also true that he was tested to an extreme degree by that presidential campaign. So the contrast. The contrast was striking on a couple of points. For the majority of what she said, it was actually pretty reasonable and tracked pretty closely to what everyone was saying, including the president. But she chose at certain moments to be extremely defensive and go on the attack. And it was not a moment to attack. It was not a moment to be explicit about seeking political advantage. And that's what's harmed her, because, you know, the president used this formulation about whether we're talking to each other in a way that's designed to heal or designed to wound, which is a very nice way of saying, are you trying to divide people, or are you trying to bring people together at that time? Now, it's one thing for us pundits to go out and enjoy conflict. That's what we do. That's what the media does. It's another thing for national leaders or people who have aspirations to be national leaders to do that too. Do I think that limits her presidential ambitions or her ability to run for president? No, actually. I mean, it does in the sense of the broader population, but the first challenge in running for president is to win your party's nomination. And I suspect that what she did with that video address and the kind of attack she was under and how she responded to it will lift her popularity with the base, with the voters who will show up in those Republican primaries. They want someone who punches back, especially at this time. So I think the more people criticize her, the more the Republican establishment tries to stop her, the stronger she gets. What doesn't kill her actually will make her extremely healthy. Now, her problem is that there aren't enough Republicans out there to be elected president. And her problem is that among independent voters, because she's not going to get Democrats, just as Obama's not going to get Republicans, among independent voters, her numbers have declined and declined sharply since she was nominated for the vice presidential slot. So people then make this logical assumption. They say, well, primary voters, Republicans are not going to vote for her because they're going to look at the numbers and say she cannot win. Oh, that just doesn't happen. No one's that sensible. You know, if people were that sensible, then the good voters of Iowa would not have voted for Barack Obama. That was Mark Penn and Hillary Clinton's case for not voting for Barack Obama because he couldn't win. He was 20, 30 points behind in all of these big states, behind Clinton, in the head-to-head matchups. He was nothing. He was nowhere. So I just don't think people vote that with a sort of pundit strategist mindset, especially in primaries. The contrast was interesting, was fascinating. It was a time when people were paying attention, especially people who don't tune into MSNBC or Fox News. And what they saw was this study in contrast. It's something that will continue, I think, through the next 2 years. Not just with Sarah Palin, but with all the Republicans. They're going to be falling over each other to land punches on Obama. That's who they are. That's the whole dynamic of winning the Republican nomination, will be to mess him up in some way. And the contrast is going to be with a president who says, I'm a grown-up, I'm trying to bring the country together, I'm trying to do big things, and there's all of this stuff going on. At some point he has to come down from his pedestal, and that's going to be a tricky moment. But for the most part, he can just be rising above it, and the contrast will be quite striking for many people. So I think it was a taste of things to come. Well, the person they most want to see is, of course, Sarah Palin. They don't think they'll be that lucky. I'm not so sure. I think it's very hard to predict at this point. The argument, the most potent argument against them is about the economy. So in their biggest fear, their biggest danger that they acknowledge is the unemployment rate, whether it comes down fast enough, whether it's below, the most obvious measure would be, is it below where it was or around where it was when, at least when he came into office, which would be, I think it was about 7.8% at the time of his inauguration. So around 8% is going to be a measure for him. Part of that is going to be the trend. I mean, if it's 8.2 and it's coming down steeply and people feel different, maybe it won't matter so much. But that opens up the door to the economic argument against him. And there you've got a choice of different Republicans who can make that case. Whether it's Mitt Romney as a sort of business executive, or Mitch Daniels as someone who's a sort of deficit hawk. I don't know that they're that troubled by Mitt Romney, but someone like Mitch Daniels is a little more troubling. Depends on how good a campaigner they are. But really, it's the economy. It's the economy above everything else. And if you look at how hard it is to unseat an incumbent president, even Karl Rove agrees with me, or I agree with him, whatever weirdness that is. It's very hard to unseat an incumbent president. And the most recent cases have all been because of the economy, really. I mean, Carter, you could say there was a foreign policy argument too, but it was also an economic argument. So I think there's a slot, there's a Sarah Palin slot, and then there's an economic Republican slot. So let's see how that figures out. Interesting that they've taken Bill Daley in and tried to neutralize the sort of business criticism. They're still, let's face it, going to have the Chamber of Commerce against them. One of the things we're going to see over the next couple of years is the EPA and the president wanting to push things along on the regulatory front on the environment. You know, the EPA is now, because of the Supreme Court ruling, has the power to regulate carbon emissions. CO2. And so they're going to do it. You can't pass legislation to do it. What they do, how they do it, is going to be a point of extremely contentious debate with the business community, with Republicans. It will be part of the big government takeover all over again. So I expect there to be a strong economic business candidate who maybe hopes they could step in if Sarah Palin stumbles. I just don't know what that stumble would look like, because the bar is so low for her. You know, I mean, she has to flub a debate. Well, she's done that. I mean, or an interview, she's done that. Accuse people of something outrageous? No, she's done that. So, reality TV? I don't know. It was an extremely abstract speech for something that was quite emotional. I mean, it was an interesting mix of the emotional storytelling about the individuals who passed and of course the people who intervened to stop the gunman. But the policy case was very abstract, values and morals. And you're quite right there. What I thought was really interesting was that for 2 years and more, people on the left and on the right to some degree have said, why does this guy want to reach out to the other side? What's the point of being in the center? He doesn't get anything for it. Republicans don't vote for him anyway. So what's the point? And here he made a moral case for reaching out and for working with the other side. And the moral case was we should live up to the ideals and expectations of the people who believe in us, not the least of which was that 9-year-old girl. That was very powerful. And I'm sure people are still going to say, why the hell is he doing deals with or trying to be bipartisan or reach out to the middle? But that's what he believes. You know, in the language of community organizing, which is where he started out, there's the world as it is and the world as it should be. It's a phrase that keeps coming up time and again with him. In fact, when he won Michelle Obama's heart, no less, she fell in love with him, she told me, listening to him give a speech in a church basement about the world as it is and the world as it should be. I told her that she should find a more romantic story, because she insisted it was really romantic. But Saul Alinsky, the father of community organizing, divides the world into those two things at the time of the civil rights movement. And he does it to say to his young organizers, forget about the world as it is, as the world as it should be, rather. Forget about your idealism. You need to be hard-headed about power, about how it's exercised, about who influences people in power, and you need to get to the heart of that and change it. You need to be more like labor organizers and be tough and masculine and not like King, who he hated. And it's an interesting time to be talking about this, but forget that stuff. World as it is beats the world as it should be. Obama turns it on its head. He says you need to do both. He actually says you need to have the world as it should be in your head, because otherwise you can't achieve anything. You're not reaching for anything. Your goals are too low. And in fact, nobody ever got anything done without a sense of hope. That's what the hope message was all about. That's exactly what he was saying about that 9-year-old girl. She believed in the world as it should be. As a 9-year-old girl, she was going to see her member of Congress thinking all the best things you could possibly think about a member of Congress. And we should live as people in the public sphere along those lines, even if we fail to meet them. That, by the way, was also the theme of the Nobel Prize winning speech, which is, if you haven't read it, if you didn't hear it, because it was in the middle of the night here and, you know, morning or afternoon in Stockholm, go read it, because it really is an extraordinary speech. And you should read them together in many ways. Because that speech is a sort of conversation with King, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who was obviously anti-war. And here he is, following in King's footsteps as the first African-American president, as a Nobel Prize winner, but also as someone who had just doubled and trebled the number of troops in Afghanistan as a war president, winning a peace prize. So world as it is and world as it should be play off each other. And he, again, this is part of being a revivalist and a survivalist. This is him saying, I want it both ways. Sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes it leads to better outcomes, to be sort of all wonkish about it. So I've drifted away from your question. I have. Remind me where I've drifted away from.
Just about whether or not he should make a speech.
Oh, yes. Should he be all highfalutin? Yes. I think you have to do both. Honestly, I think you have to do both. As a communicator, he has to make it concrete. As he did with his speech, he has to make it real for people. He cannot just be abstract. But it's really remarkable that one of the things that really moved people was the abstract piece of that speech, was the policy piece of that speech. It wasn't just that he did the memorial thing about telling these people's stories and their lives. He took it to another level, and people responded to that in a way that, if you believe what we in the media say all the time, is not what people want to hear. You know, politics should be more visceral, more simplistic, and here he was making it complicated. And yet there was an emotional reaction to that, to ideals. I think that's uniquely actually American. And he speaks to something especially American. It was not a coincidence that he started out that speech with the words, as an American. There are many people out there who don't think he is, or don't think he shares American values. And in fact, he speaks to a unique set of American values, which is an idealism, an optimism, a sense of reaching for something better. If you gave that speech in Europe or in Asia, and you said, we can do so much, people would laugh at you. They would just laugh at you. They would say, who the hell do you think you are? Stop reaching so high, because that's not what politicians do or are. Well, I think that's true. I think it's extremely hard to be in government at a time when the economy is struggling so badly. What's interesting, though, one of the ways you give reassurance is to explain things. And they're at a point now where they can tell a good story. Not because they're good storytellers, but because although things are still bad for many, many people, they're nowhere near what they were in that first sort of 6 months of the presidency. The stock market bottomed out in March of 2009 at 6,600. Now it's 11,700 or so. It's up 70 or 80% in 20 months. Unemployment is still high, but it always lags. There would be even higher unemployment in the upper Midwest were it not for what this administration and the last administration, talk about being bipartisan, something he shares with Bush, to save the car industry was no small achievement. In fact, most people just predicted the whole thing was a waste of money. In fact, the new House Republican leadership said that they should just let the whole thing go under. So try selling that to Michigan in 2012. GM was finished, and yet just a month or two ago, it was the biggest IPO, the stock market offering, in American history. And I think that's a story they have to tell. Part of the reassurance as you come out of a bad recession, it is explaining how far this country has come in an extremely short period of time. Nobody predicted that in less than 2 years, the stock market would rebound, the job market would turn around. It just didn't feel like that would ever happen. And if you can do that in 2 years, just think what this country could do in another 2 years. So one of the things people look back on, of course, everyone says history plays and memory plays tricks on you. He should be more like FDR. You know, I said to Joe Biden as I was interviewing him for this book, with the Recovery Act, his job is to sort of sell the Recovery Act. Biden said they didn't sell the Recovery Act in the right way. They talked about saving or creating jobs. He said that's not what we should have said. We should have said we're saving people from the abyss. That's what we were doing with all the benefits and the firefighters' jobs and the state budgets, unemployment benefits. And I said, well, why didn't you come up with a Hoover Dam project, a big infrastructure thing? And in rather salty terms, since this is streaming on the web and my kids might stumble across it, he said, basically, give me a break. You know, do you know how long it took to build the Hoover Dam? He said, you give me 5 or 7 years, I'll build you a Hoover Dam. But we didn't have that luxury. So they didn't find a message, they didn't find a storyline, but they have one now. And that's part of the reassurance that I think you're right. People are looking for at a very troubled economic time. Him being unconventional, though, is always going to be unsettling. He is not a conventional Democrat. He's not a conventional African-American politician. I remember walking into one of his top campaign people in 2008, and I just said, it was lunchtime. I said to him as we were walking past each other, how's it going? The guy said, well, it would be a lot easier if he weren't black and called Barack Hussein Obama. That's a fact of life. It's a fact of life. So I think people are going to be struggling to put him in context for many years to come. I've always thought that the enduring question about this president is going to be, who is he? It's an identity question. Just as the enduring question about Bush is going to be, was he stupid? Or why did he invade Iraq? You should buy Decision Points, by the way. Also buy Crown. It's also a great publishing house. So enduring questions are going to be there. But remember, again, this weekend, he's not Martin Luther King, okay? So I raise this comparison not because I think he's an icon or he's a great historic leader in the same way. But when King was alive, opinions were sharply divided about who he was and what he represented. Was he the sign of hope or a dangerous radical who was undermining America? And we're seeing an extremely polarized debate about this guy now. He is not, just to repeat, in case someone just clicked on the web link at this point, I am not saying that he is actually like Martin Luther King. But unconventional politicians who break the mold take sort of years to digest and understand. And I'm sure, someone will write a book and come to this bookstore in 10 years, because this bookstore is still going to be here and thriving in 10 years. And they'll say, well, we finally figured him out. And by then, you're going to have 2/3 of America saying they voted for the guy, whether they did or not. It's early in this story. And I'll just end on this. Some people said, how come you're writing another book so quickly about this guy? And my standard response, quite genuinely, was, well, it's not like nothing has happened. I promise you I won't be writing one every year, but at least I promised my publisher and my family that. But this story is only just unfolding, and it will take a long time to figure out who he is and how we have changed as we've gone through this, because the country is changing all the time. Nothing static. So thank you for having me. Thank you for your questions.